Nate Saunders and Lawrence Edmondson here from ESPN to talk about the only real story we have at the moment in Formula One, and that is Lewis Hamilton joining Ferrari. Nate, it's been a week or so since we've seen the first pictures like this one of Lewis Hamilton up Ferrari in red in the car. What did you make of it all? Did it live up to your expectations of this huge move in Formula One?
Lewis Hamilton in Ferrari red. It finally happened, and it looks incredible. Check this out.
Yeah, it did. Considering we waited a year for it, I think, Formula One moves are always kind of strange, aren't they? Because usually you see a driver wearing the hat or wearing the kit, and it's all a bit underwhelming. This one wasn't at all underwhelming. I mean, that's one of the coolest pictures you're going to see in Formula One. Ferrari's always had this aura about it, and I think that picture just screams aura, doesn't it? You've got Lewis dressed like that. It's Enzo Ferrari's house. It's the F40. You've got Fiorano. I mean, you can't see Fiorano, but you know he's there. And yeah, it just, everything about it, we waited a year for it. And I think that they did it perfectly. It wasn't too over the top. All felt very natural. And I think, yeah, people are still getting used to the image of Lewis in red, which for me, I remember the Vettel move to Ferrari. I remember when we first saw him in red, and it was kind of, whoa, after seeing him in Red Bull. This is even weirder because we've seen so many times Lewis. Obviously, it's changed from grey to the black suit, but still, it was still Mercedes colours. It was, it was all the Mercedes stuff that you have with it. And this is just is great. So yeah, I loved it. What about you? I mean, for me, I thought it was as good as they could have done. What do you think?
Well, I remember Lewis saying last year that he looks good in red, and
yeah,
I kind of agree. It did kind of look natural. It feels like the right progression for a driver of his talent at this stage of his career. And the choice of the F40 as well, I've got a lot of love for that.
Same.
Because it's a car from the 1980s, like late 80s. I think it was the last one that was really signed off under Enzo Ferrari as well. But for Lewis as well, apparently it's his favourite supercar. It's what Ferrari told us. I mean, maybe they would say that, but I wouldn't be surprised. And it probably links into those boyhood memories of Ferrari. He said that he's wanted to drive for them since he was a kid, and I bet the F40 when that was knocking around. Like me, well, at that age, that was such a cool car. So yeah, to see him to be able to do that, basically live out his dream, for someone like Lewis to still have stuff that makes him truly excited this late in his career is great. And you can't help but get on board with it.
He's hitting 40, isn't he? Or was it 39 this year? I think he's hitting 40.
He's 40, yeah.
And so to that point, exactly, like he's that old. He's not cynical about it. He turned up, and I think the only person who was happier than all the fans when he was there was him. You could see it just glowing out of him. So I thought that was great, and we'll see how long it lasts. But I mean, this is exactly the kind of the hype and the excitement that you would expect. And quick shout out, the return to the yellow helmet as well. It's kind of the moderner tinge of yellow, which is the the background for the prancing horse. Oh, it was fantastic, and it just looked great. So yeah, really, really good week.
Could they have done this any better? Ferrari understands spectacle, but this wasn't just about showmanship. It was about history, passion, and pure racing DNA. Lewis in red, the F40, Enzo's house. Every element was carefully chosen to make it feel like fate, not just another driver move. And if anyone still had doubts about this switch, that picture alone silenced them.
And perfectly fits with him, of course, because when he first started in Formula One, he had the yellow helmet, slightly inspired by Senna, had it through karting. And I think he had it a couple of seasons at Mercedes, but more often at Mercedes, it was either a white or black and purple helmet. And so, yeah, a real kind of nice shift onto something new, and it does feel fresh, which is fantastic for Formula One in general, I think.
Yeah,
of course, a big question about how well this move goes is how he matches up against teammate Charles Leclerc.
Yep.
Now, Leclerc, we're not talking about a champion yet, but we are talking about someone who is considered one of the fastest drivers over one lap, potentially one of the most naturally gifted of his generation coming through. So what can we expect from that battle, especially early on in the season?
Yeah, it's tantalising, isn't it? Because I think if you look at last year from the summer break to the end of the season, Charles was probably the best driver, in terms of form. He won Monza, won Austin, obviously had the Monaco win. I think the rap on Charles has always been that there's been peaks, isn't there? His highs are incredibly high, and he can sometimes just disappear a little bit in races, and that happens with drivers, And I think Charles' one thing is he's never quite had some of the cars that Lewis has had or the cars Max has had to really win that championship. We saw at the early stage of 22, when we thought Ferrari had the title-winning car, or at least title-challenging car, how good he could be. I think the big question underlying it is not about Charles. I think we know how good Charles is, and I think that Charles one day should win a world championship. For me, and I'd love to know what you think about this, I think the thing that defines all of this season is what Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari are getting. There's been a lot of talk. Is he burnt out? Has he lost a step? Whatever. Can you lose a step on a race car? I don't know. I don't know what the equivalent would be. But I think that's really what's going to define it. And I don't really buy it that Lewis has lost anything. I think that he lost some motivation, lost some love at Mercedes for everything. But I think coming back and to what we were talking about his passion and kind of his that reignited fire in him, I think we're going to see the best Lewis. And for me, as somebody who grew up loving Ferrari and wanting Ferrari to win championships, that's great for one thing, because the idea that Lewis could challenge for a title. But if you're Ferrari as well, what a perfect way to measure Charles Leclerc as well. Like, we'll really see. We know he's good. I think this year we'll answer the question: is he very, very good, or is he great? And I think that's one of the most exciting parts of this, is that if Charles beats Lewis, that's huge. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that you can do in a Formula One car, is beat a world champion teammate. So I think early on I can see it being Charles, but the key will be by the end of the year that points gap, because there was a few times Sainz beat Charles in points over the year. So I think that's where the consistency for Charles will come on. But I mean, I can't call it. I really can't. And I think it's going to be super close. And I think both of them, from what we heard last season, I think both of them relish that opportunity to go against each other in the same car as well. There's a real mutual respect you can feel there as well.
If Leclerc wants to cement himself as a future world champion, what better way than beating Lewis Hamilton in the same car? We know Charles is one of the fastest over a single lap, but is he ready for the full season consistency and racecraft battle that Lewis brings? And for Hamilton, if this move reignites his fire, could we see a version of him even sharper than before? The margins will be razor thin, and that's exactly what Ferrari needs.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think my one concern for Lewis is his qualifying record going into
really
this season. And really it's his qualifying record in this type of car, this latest generation of Formula One car, which is only around for another year, so things will change again in 2026. But clearly he struggled in the Mercedes version of this latest regulations to get the feel he needs, especially under braking, to get the most from the car, sometimes actually over pushing, which is not something that you'd usually associate with Lewis Hamilton unless he's getting it absolutely right. So meanwhile, Charles Leclerc, incredibly good in qualifying, and there's a couple of things which are going to be fascinating to see play out, because last year Lewis Hamilton was beaten 19-5 in regular qualifying sessions by George Russell,
which is mad for Lewis. Like,
which is crazy.
His
for
history.
Lewis against any teammate, that's pretty much unheard of. And with Charles, I think perhaps he's another step ahead in qualifying. The other thing where I think Leclerc really proved to us very early in his career quite how good he was is when he went into the team with Sebastian Vettel.
Yeah.
Now, at that point, Sebastian Vettel was the incumbent, a four-time world champion. Okay, arguably, again, maybe wasn't really he was struggling a bit with that generation of car compared to his heyday of winning 4 world championships with Red Bull. But Leclerc just came in and made Vettel look, to be honest, quite average by the end of that season. And I remember going into that year, and Ferrari were quite clear. Vettel was the team leader. If there were any 50-50 situations, it would go Vettel's way. That quickly changed to Leclerc. Now, there's been no talk of that yet at Ferrari. I think they'll go in with very much a kind of open mind over who can come out as the best driver. But yeah, if Leclerc can stamp his authority early on, then Lewis's job is made all that bit harder. Having said all that, I think Lewis is a different beast to Sebastian Vettel. I think he's a much more rounded driver, and I think obviously with all the hype that's coming into here, it's almost easy to forget that Charles Leclerc is actually still in that second car, because even Ferrari, when they were putting out all the photos, it was like, oh, and by the way, here's all the photos of Charles doing laps of Iran as well. Don't forget.
Ferrari's biggest challenge isn't just external competition, it's managing their own drivers. Leclerc is a proven force in qualifying, and if he starts the season strong, the momentum could shift in his favor quickly. But Hamilton is a different caliber of driver compared to Vettel, and his ability to adapt over a season will be key. The dynamic between them could determine Ferrari's success more than outright car performance.
To me, almost, I don't think it's a bad thing for Charles, because all the weight of expectation is on Lewis's shoulders. And I think that one of the things that I've always felt sorry for with Charles is, I think Carlos Sainz did a great job, but it's always felt like Charles has been the leader of that team, whether symbolically or whatever. And it feels like he has struggled shouldering that immense pressure that comes with Ferrari. There's been a lot of times when you've just, he's looked crushed, he's looked a bit beaten. So I think now Lewis coming in kind of takes a lot of that pressure away, because Charles will still want to win and he'll still want to do well, but all of the media focus is going to be on Lewis. All of the Italian, the Italian media especially, who are great, but they can be a double-edged sword for Ferrari. They're going to be talking about Lewis. They know the Charles storyline. They know everything about Charles. They're still kind of getting to grips with this part of it. So I think that's going to be really interesting. Just on your point about qualifying quickly, we saw last year, didn't we? And this is where I think Charles really can take a step. We saw in the past, Ferrari's car had been a very good qualifying car and then faded in races. It flipped around last year in a way, didn't it? Where the car could actually compete better in the races. And I think that if Lewis is struggling to qualify, that will really hurt him because he's going to be up against it. He'll have a good race car to come back through the field. But if Charles is starting ahead of him, we know, don't we, in Formula One, when there's a 50-50 situation in teams, often the easiest way to call strategy is the lead car gets the better strategy. Yep. The lead car is the guy that can win the race. So if there's a good undercut on Max Verstappen or on a McLaren, the lead car's going to get it. So that's where, if Lewis can't get his head around qualifying, I think that will really play out across the season when it comes to Sundays. So really interesting ingredient to it. And I agree with you. I think that will be the edge. And I think it could really be significant, especially early on for Charles. So I wouldn't want to call it myself. But I think, in those early races, I can definitely see Charles being the lead guy.
Yeah, and tough competition this year. We're expecting 4 teams at the front. So, if you're not qualifying quite right and your teammate can be on the front row, you could be down in 8th.
Yeah.
So that can be the difference.
Which, and that's not wildly out there to say. We saw that quite a lot. I mean, I'm not saying Lewis is going to do what Perez did, but the gap, the fine margin between doing well and doing badly can be really, really big, and it can cost you big time. So, it's going to be one to watch.
Is this the perfect scenario for Charles to thrive? With Lewis taking the spotlight, he can focus purely on performance without the crushing expectation of leading Ferrari alone. But if Hamilton struggles in qualifying, how much will that hurt him in a season where 4 teams are fighting at the front? When every 10th matters, can he afford to be playing catch-up on Sundays?
We should say, however, at this stage, Ferrari are doing absolutely everything they can to get Lewis Hamilton up to speed. He's done a couple of tests, one at Fiorano, basically just to get used to the team, and it was really his whole introduction to the team. And you've got a test track right there, you've got a 2-year-old car ready to be fired up. Why not stick him in it for just 30 laps? Because they wanted to limit his testing there to some extent, because they knew that the more valuable testing would come in Spain, which is where he is at the moment, and has been completing a number of laps. So how useful are these tests? What's actually going on? Are these tests between Ferrari and Hamilton, because he can't drive the current car yet?
Yeah, so this is obviously the TPC, isn't it? The testing of previous cars. I think it's 1,000 kilometers a driver's limited to. So it was the 2022 car in Fiorano.
2023.
Sorry, 23 car in Fiorano. I think he's doing that the same again. They're both doing the same again in Spain. And then they've got a tyre test at the start of February, which I think might be last year's car. It's a mule version of last year's car, which is kind of modified by Pirelli for Pirelli.
Yeah, so 26 tyres they're testing. So tyres for 2026, and therefore a mule car to simulate roughly what the 2026 car might be doing.
Yeah, so he's getting kind of a bit of a mix. And then obviously pre-season testing starts on February 26th. That will be his first real experience with that car. But in terms of how important they are, I think very. I mean, we know nowadays, you mentioned Fiorano, back in the day, Schumacher could turn up at 6 a.m., he could test until 6 p.m. non-stop, and then Ferrari could pack it up and then do it again the next day. And that's one of the things that Ferrari was able to kind of hone their advantage with. You can't do that now. What these are going to be crucial for is Lewis is coming out of a decade plus with Mercedes. They had a certain way of working, a certain way of communicating between themselves, the way strategies are called, the way the meetings go. He's got a new race engineer for the first time in 11 years, Riccardo Adami. He's going to be learning the Italian for hammer time, no doubt, which is Tempo di Martello, I believe. So if you hear that on the radio, you heard it here first. Tempo di Martello would be a better way of
Sounds good.
It does, yeah. I mean, doesn't quite roll off the tongue in the same way, but maybe we hear something different. But I think that's really what Lewis is doing at the moment. Obviously, that's one area where clearly Charles has an advantage in the sense of he knows the team, he understands how it works, and little things like that. Drivers can be so sensitive to small things. Whether it's just the way their feedback goes, whatever. Lewis has experienced enough that none of that will really faze him, but I think it's just getting used to all of that stuff, understand. And the steering wheel will be completely new as well, like little things like that we kind of forget about when we're just watching on TV. So I think very important, but really for him, the key stuff in terms of performance is really going to be, like for every driver, is going to be that pre-season testing. This is just stuff that they need to tick off before he gets there. And actually, I think they've done quite a good job of using that time, I think, with Lewis, both for PR purposes and also just for kind of the team cohesion at this point, I think.
Ferrari is doing everything possible to integrate Lewis into the team before real testing begins. These laps aren't about raw speed, but about familiarity, working with his new race engineer, adapting to Ferrari's way of doing things, and ensuring that when he finally drives the 2024 car, he's not wasting time on basic adjustments. With testing so restricted in modern F1, every lap, even in an old car, helps fine-tune those details that could make all the difference in a tight championship fight.
Yeah, Fred Vasseur talked to a few of us at the end of last year and basically said, look, guy's a 7-time world champion. We don't need to be too worried about him getting up to speed. He's confident that the experience will ultimately win through, and I mean that Lewis is absolutely ready for that first race. But all these little things help. Like say, I mean, steering wheel, you've got to learn a brand new thing. I'm sure Lewis will. He's very capable at all that kind of stuff. And he'll probably come with some ideas as well of things that he wants to change. But all of that needs to be kind of set by the time you get to Australia because, like you say, it's so tight, so competitive in Formula One at the moment that you can't be giving away anything as a second thought. You can't have a misunderstanding over the radio. So, a number of teams have been doing these TPC testings at the start of this year, especially where the new drivers are involved. Haas have done one, for example, in Jerez because they've got 2 new drivers, Esteban Ocon and Ollie Behrman, and 2 new race engineers with them. And they've just been trying to gel the team together. So that was the main objective of that test, again, in a 2-year-old car. Which kind of neatly brings on to the question, Nate. I mean, we've been talking now constantly about Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari and a little bit about Charles Leclerc. But is this going to just dominate the opening races, especially if he does well?
I mean, look, if Lewis wins out of the gate, and Alonso did that, Raikkonen did that, Mansell did that, Fangio did that, first race with Ferrari won there. So it's not, there's historical precedent for it. If he does that, I think it's, the hype train is massive. I think if Charles wins the first race, it's massive for a different reason because it's like it goes against the grain. But I think as the preseason wears on, I think we'll see this dip a little bit because we came out of last season with such a fascinating situation. So many teams that could win races. Were Red Bull imploding? Were they just having a bad season? That will be a really big thing to watch in preseason testing. McLaren is going in for the first time in recent memory as the team to beat coming into winter testing. They're the favourites going into it. So preseason will shift it all around again, and I think that everything we hear will have a Lewis Hamilton tinge to it. It will all be framed in some way like that. But I think the biggest part of it will be at that O2 event in London in a few weeks' time. I think that I feel sorry for the other teams there because if Lewis is there with Ferrari, it's very much going to be the Lewis Hamilton show. But that's natural. You've got the best driver of all time in terms of the record books with the best and most famous team of all time. It was always going to be the way. The only way it's going to die out is if it turns out to be a damp squib, I think.
It's fascinating to think about the level of pressure Lewis Hamilton will face in this new chapter with Ferrari. His experience is invaluable, but adapting to the team dynamic, especially with a new race engineer, will require a level of precision that could make or break his season. Ferrari's culture and expectations will push him to prove himself in ways even a 7-time world champion hasn't experienced before.
Which leads me on to the final question we have here in front of us, is the ultimate question really around Lewis Hamilton going to Ferrari. Can he win the title in his first season with the team? And if not his first season, can he secure that 8th title before he retires from F1?
Because it's Lewis, you've always got to think he can. I mean, I think he's such a, to the point you said Fred made, you can't write, it's like with Max, even if Max doesn't have the best car, you have to consider Max a favourite to win a championship. With Lewis, I think he's going there. He's going to be hungrier. Like I said earlier, I don't buy this idea that we're getting a watered down version of Lewis who's not competitive. But I think the key is going to be actually in the driver's context, and this is where maybe putting 2 thoroughbreds together isn't the best idea, is how much are Lewis and Charles actually going to take points off each other as the season goes on. I can see Ferrari win the constructors this year because of that lineup. But in terms of your drivers, they're going to have such a headache so many times this year where Lewis and Charles are like, I want this call. And Ferrari can only give one of them the best call, So I think that will play out as the season goes on. So I would say less likely than likely that he wins the title. So I'd say, 75% chance I'd say he's got of not winning. Just because he's there, it's new. Ferrari, have that dynamic, but I don't think you can write it out. So I sound like I'm sitting on the fence. I'm going to say, I said in our video last year, I think he's going to win the championship. I'm still going to stick to that in terms of if he can win early on, absolutely. But if he has a slow start, we saw with McLaren last year, slow start for Lando, couldn't get back in time. So yeah, I think he can. Whether he will or not is another question. But him and Charles Leclerc should be going to this year thinking I can win the championship. I'm being a little bit, I'm not really putting myself out there. I mean, do you feel more strongly than I can? Because I know that when we've talked about the two of them, you've always thought Charles can beat Lewis this year overall. Does that mean you think Charles can beat him to a title or just beat him in the standings?
It's hard to count out Lewis Hamilton, especially when you consider his track record. That hunger for his 8th title will drive him, and Ferrari's team could benefit from his experience. But the biggest hurdle remains whether he and Charles Leclerc can coexist without stepping on each other's toes too much. Ferrari might struggle to balance their two thoroughbreds, and that could hurt both drivers' chances for the title, especially if internal politics start to interfere.
Yeah, and I think that is an important distinction to make. How competitive is this car going to be straight away? How obvious is it that they're going for a title early on? And then if you think back to Lewis's times that Lewis has had a car to win a title and not succeeded, you basically got his rookie season in F1 and 2021.
Yeah.
And 2021, we could sit here and have probably an equal amount of time arguing over what happened there. But, I felt like certainly Lewis was good enough to win that title, as was Max. But, Lewis, by kind of any kind of estimation or measurement, was in a position to be able to win that title. So when it's all on the line, and this is something that people at Mercedes have said time and time again, Lewis can just access this extra level of ability. And I don't think we've seen that over the last few years because the car simply hasn't been good enough to challenge occasionally for wins, but to challenge for championships, no. And so if the car is there, I think we will see that extra bit of Lewis, and therefore he beats him. If the car isn't quite there, and even if we're talking like, it wins 3 or 4 races, but clearly the McLaren or the Red Bull is better, that's a situation where I can see Charles maybe getting the better of Lewis. But I mean, that's why it's great, because neither of us can call it at this stage.
And it's genuine as well. I'm not neither of us are trying to be, kind of cute about it or whatever. It's genuinely difficult. And this is our professional careers on the line as well, right? So I feel the same as you. It's just, it's like a knife edge, isn't it?
Yeah. But I'm going to say if the car's there, Lewis wins the title.
Okay.
The key question will always be about the car, and in the case of Hamilton, how much Ferrari can give him to compete for the title. We've seen time and time again that when he's in a championship-caliber car, Lewis finds another gear. But if Ferrari's machine doesn't stack up to Red Bull or McLaren, then the title could slip away, and Charles Leclerc might prove to be the more consistent option for Ferrari's hopes.
Nice. I think that's what I was getting at in my kind of convoluted answer. I think, genuinely, I think that the magic you talk about as well, there's something to be said for that element of Lewis and going into Ferrari as well. There's just a romanticism about Ferrari, and Ferrari can get swept up in passion and stuff like that. But with Fred as well, I think he's been a real leveling influence there. And so you've suddenly got this situation where I think this is the perfect time for Lewis to go to Ferrari. There's some parallels, isn't there? I'm not saying we're going to see a Schumacher level era, but Ferrari and De Montezemolo and Todd only added Schumacher when the team was in the right position to win a championship. You feel similar with Lewis right now, that he's coming in. If he'd come in 2 years ago, you'd have been like, well, is this the right time for him to come in? Right now, it does feel right. And let's not forget, this guy has previous in making incredibly wise career decisions. He's only made one, but I mean, it was a pretty good one. And I mean, maybe he's made 2 because he found Ron Dennis at the Autosport Awards one time, didn't he? And said,
That's right.
Here's my phone number. So he's got previous for that. And just one on that as well. And I think it's part of the story that is just so exciting. I think whichever of these two guys, if either of these two guys win the championship, we're talking about a legendary status that few drivers have had. We've got the Ferrari drought. You've got either story. You've got Lewis winning the 8th, beating Schumacher's record in a Ferrari, winning it with 3 teams. Or you've got Charles, kind of the prodigal son, beating the greatest guy of all time, ending the drought as well. I just think either one of those stories is so compelling. I think it would be, Max has obviously done an incredible job and even some of Lewis's championships at Mercedes, it was like, okay, great, he's won the championship. This would be a level above, I think, in terms of what we've seen lately, just because of the weight of history behind it.
The storylines surrounding this potential championship battle are nothing short of legendary. Whether it's Hamilton achieving his 8th title with Ferrari, cementing his status in a way that's never been done before, or Leclerc stepping up to end Ferrari's long drought and beat the greatest of all time, the weight of history makes this season incredibly exciting. With Fred's steady influence, Ferrari seems poised to make a real challenge, and the stage is set for something monumental.